Hello and welcome to the first episode of the new podcast here on Racing News Now. If you are a follower of RNN, you probably know me already. I'm sorry that you would have that misfortune, but if you don't know me, I'm Garth Allan, and my esteemed colleague here to, I believe it's going to be on my left. Yes, there. Mr. Tyler Guthrie is a face that you may not know, or if you're listening to the audio version, a voice you may not know. So, Tyler, hello, and give us a little background on yourself.
Oh, hello, Garth. You probably never heard of me before. Just kind of casual NASCAR fan, getting back into it. Been around for a while, but favorites have left and trying to come back and get some more and just wanting to talk about it.
But you haven't completely fallen out of motorsports. I mean, you're still following IndyCar fairly close, aren't you?
Yeah, I keep most of my tabs on IndyCar. NASCAR is just kind of like a side thing. I've always been interested in it, but like I said, my favorite driver's retired and trying to get back into it, find another reason to fall back in love with the sport, and just kind of interested in racing in general.
So, and that's kind of the reason that we're calling this podcast Rookie Stripes, because you've got me that if you've watched RNN, you know I've been around for a while, and I like to think I know NASCAR fairly well. Some people may have differing opinions on that, but I like to think I know what I'm talking about sometimes. Tyler, on the other hand, is the more casual side of the spectrum, trying to learn things and maybe move from casual into more of a hardcore fan. So at some point, we're hoping we get to rip his rookie stripes off, ergo the title of the podcast. So that is the hope. Tyler, are you ready to get those rookie stripes ripped off eventually?
Yeah, see how it goes. I don't have any broadcast or online experience either, so just figuring out one step at a time.
Perfect. So this is going to be a disaster. All right. So let's talk about week number one. We've got the start of, well, not technically the start of the NASCAR season this week, as this was not a points race, but the first NASCAR sanctioned event of 2023, the Busch Light Clash at the LA Coliseum. And I think it delivered on about exactly what I expected it to after last year. Tyler, was this your first Clash at the Coliseum, or did you see this race last year?
No, I watched it last year, but I remember it not being as much of a crash fest last year.
Yeah, especially the end of the race. I think Mike Joy alluded to this on the broadcast at one point. I think we went like the last 60 laps caution free last year or something like that. So definitely some changes this year. And I think a lot of that had to do with this was the first race last year for the next gen car, and parts were very scarce. Not a lot of the teams barely had enough cars to cover each car. A lot of them didn't even have backup cars at that point. So they were a little more hesitant to get to Beatin and Bangin. Now they don't really have a part shortage. They've got plenty of cars. So there's no real hesitancy for that. And things got a little crazy in this race, I'd say.
Yeah, you can definitely tell this year people were starting to bump into each other a lot more. It seemed like it was a more gloves off approach than last year, but I think they had a year to figure out how to run at the next gen cars, and everybody feels more comfortable driving them hard into each other. And I think with the composite bodies that the Xfinity Series, now the Cup Series, have been having the past couple of years, you can beat and bang on each other a little bit more than you used to be able to.
Well, there was certainly a lot of beating and banging. There was a lot of accordion wrecks in this race that I don't know that we've seen a lot of in the past, where you'd get three or four cars lined up down into the corner. The guy in the back would run into the car in front of him and it would accordion through, and like three or four cars in front of them would be the wreck. It was like one of those what do they call it, an abacus machine? You know what I'm talking about, where you pull the ball to the side and it comes back and the balls in the middle don't move, the ball on the other side swings out. You know what I'm talking about?
Right, I know what you're talking about, and I think it was kind of interesting. A couple quotes from drivers after the race saying they didn't know who to be mad at because there
Mm-hmm.
were so many people involved. I think we see this every once in a while at Martinsville, but it's never to this extent.
Right. Like you might get one or two like this at Martinsville, but this was practically every wreck in this race. And I think a lot of guys were figuring out that they could do something like this and really get off scot-free because the guy that actually wrecked wouldn't know who to blame.
Right, that seemed like a lot of everybody's mad at everybody, but nobody could really retaliate. Before we get too far into it, let's go with the race results. Martin Truex Jr. in the 19 for Joe Gibbs Racing kind of ran away with it at the end. Obviously, they kept having restarts after crash, but every restart he was able to kind of get ahead. Austin Dillon, solid result in second place, and his teammate Kyle Busch right behind him in the 8 car for the first time in 2023. Both of them had a good race and had a little bit of teamwork at the end. Kyle Busch kind of let Austin Dillon by when he started banging on him.
Kyle was
Alex
very
Bowman,
impressive in his first start in the 8 car. Sorry, I didn't
I
mean to cut you
agree.
off there.
No, I agree. I think he did pretty well. He started kind of mid pack and was always up at the front, but never really made a whole bunch of too daring moves. Fourth place, you got Alex Bowman in the 48. Typical Alex Bowman race. You never know he's there until the end of the race, and you look at the top five, and he's there somehow. Kyle Larson, another quiet race in the 5, finishing fifth place. Tyler Reddick in sixth place, new team in the number 45 car. Ryan Preece in seventh and number 41 for Stuart Haas. I think Ryan Preece did a pretty good race. Got shuffled back a little bit towards the end, but about the last 2/3 of the race, up there most of the time. Ross Chastain in eighth and Denny Hamlin in ninth. They were able to find each other for another wreck to start off 2023. And rounding out your top 10, you got William Byron in 24, another typical William Byron race, I would say.
Yeah. So there's a few guys to talk about in there. First off, Austin Dillon, good run in second. What's with the mustache, though? He hasn't had a mustache before now, I don't think, unless I'm forgetting this. He doesn't look right with a mustache. Like, it doesn't fit. It doesn't look good on him. It reminds me of early days Jeff Gordon mustache. You remember what Jeff Gordon looked
Oh
like? I mean,
gosh.
that was before you were born, but I'm sure you've seen pictures of Jeff Gordon in the early days with that mustache that looked
Oh yeah.
absolutely terrible.
Straight out of the late 90s, you know.
Yes, that's what Austin Dillon's mustache looks like. I don't know who told him. I don't know if it was his wife or who told him that looked good, but Austin, they're lying to you. It doesn't look good. Shave it.
You know what though?
What?
Mustache may have gotten him second place in the Clash.
Maybe. Well, okay. I will believe that if he continues to run well to start the season. If this is just a fluke and he has the mustache for the remainder of the season or however long and he doesn't consistently run this well, it's not the mustache.
I did think that a good point that Mike Joy brought up on broadcast was that Kyle Busch is going to be a great influence on that team at RCR. And I think he showed that with the 2-3 finish here at the Clash, first race of the season. Obviously, shaking out some cobwebs, but both of those cars doing really well.
Well, and that team needed some veteran leadership because before Kyle, it was Austin Dillon and Tyler Reddick, which Tyler Reddick is a phenomenal talent and is going to have a very successful career. But I don't think Austin Dillon is cut out to be the senior leadership of a team. And I think that was really hurting RCR to have Austin Dillon be that kind of senior guy there. To bring Kyle Busch in with his experience, love him or hate him, he's got the experience, he's been successful. And I think that will help this team. How much it will help this team, I'm not sure because they needed some help. Reddick was able to do some things in that 8 car, but I think we're going to see he's able to do much, much more in that 45 car now that he's got even better equipment.
I'd have to agree. And I think that probably Bubba Wallace and Tyler Reddick are probably not considered to be the same level, I wouldn't think so much, but they're kind of up and coming younger drivers. You don't have, I wouldn't say that Bubba Wallace would be a comparison to Austin Dillon in that team. I'd like to bring up in 11th place, just outside top 10, Justin Haley. I think he had a really solid run. He got turned around towards the beginning of the race, but clawed his way back up to 11th, and can't say that much for a lot of other people that finished outside the top 10.
No, definitely not. And Justin Haley was fast in this race last year, so that didn't really surprise me. Actually, he was fastest in qualifying on Saturday. Was it Saturday they had the actual qualifying?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, so he was fastest there. Almost won his heat race, so didn't really surprise me how fast he was. Didn't I think he should have definitely had a better finish than what he had. I don't know that he was necessarily fast enough to win, but I think he definitely had a top 10 car, if not a top 5 car at the very least.
Yeah, it did seem like towards the beginning of the race he got shuffled back with that spin and then just kind of kept getting in everybody else's accident. And it's hard to move up when you're in mid pack and track that small.
Yeah.
Kevin Harvick coming in 12th. He kind of brushed the gloves off for a little bit with Todd Gilliland there in the middle of the race.
Yes, he did. And there was a lot of that between different people, and I think the thing with Harvick is he did this a little bit last year in this race too. He's not been super fast at the Coliseum either time he showed up. He's not had race winning speed. I don't know if it's that they're not bringing a good car for him in this race or he just has not figured this track out. But either way, he has not been super fast in this race. So I think he seems to go with the mindset of let's build the entertainment. And he ends up just shoving people around and trying to make things exciting. He did it in his heat race where he was just shoving Chase Elliott like every single lap, trying to get that transfer spot in the heat race. And it actually ended up being a super exciting finish to their heat race where Stenhouse and Elliott had gotten a little bit away from Harvick and they were having the battle for the transfer spot. Elliott shoves Stenhouse out of the way into turn 1 on the last lap, takes that transfer spot. Stenhouse then goes down into turn 3, shoves Elliott out of the way, but goes in too deep, opens the door for Harvick to get by both of them, and Harvick beats Elliott to the line by a few inches. Super exciting. And that may have been the most exciting moment of the entire night. And that was in a heat race.
Yeah. And then one of the last chance qualifiers with Chase Elliott and Ty Gibbs going at each other at the end was pretty good racing there too.
Yeah. I mean, there were moments of good racing, but there was also moments when the pack would kind of get strung out and it just got a little boring too. And of course they'd get bunched right back up when somebody would wreck, and then the whole cautions breed cautions thing that definitely reared its head in this race as well.
I think at one point it almost took about an hour and a half to run 20 green flag laps.
Yeah, that'll happen when you don't count caution laps.
Todd Gilliland and Michael McDowell DNF in 23 and 24th positions. Both ran out of fuel because they weren't allowed to refuel after their qualifier races.
And that brings up an inherent problem, I think. I don't even know if you can call it a problem necessarily, but it brings up an issue with the whole not counting caution laps to where I bet you they ran at least 50 laps that didn't get counted in this race.
Oh, at least 50 laps that didn't count. I think probably every wreck they had 7 or 8 caution laps because of how short that track is, but just a little bit of short-sightedness from NASCAR for not even allowing them the chance to fuel their cars back up in between their races.
Right.
AJ Allmendinger in 20th, kind of beating the doors off everybody the whole race. Chase Elliott, not much happened with him in the final race there in the Clash.
No, he really didn't do much all night. I mean, he didn't really do anything in his heat race, ended up in He ended up in the second last chance qualifier, didn't he? He didn't even advance out of the first one, right?
Yeah, I think so. And then he and Ty Gibbs had that showdown at the finish, but it
Mm-hmm.
was the two of them running away from the field for the most part.
Yeah. Well, I mean, once you got down to the second last chance qualifier, they were like the only ones that weren't like a Corey LaJoy or a Harrison Burton. That nothing against those two, but they don't have the speed to compare to Chase Elliott and Ty Gibbs most of the time, at least.
All right. Bubba Wallace in 22nd. I was actually fairly impressed with Bubba Wallace through the middle of the race. Had a like a 6 or 7 restart frenzy there with Martin Truex Jr. and beat him off the line every time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bubba was impressive. Had a lot of speed, and then he had his little brush up with Austin Dillon near the end. Those two, you could tell almost immediately after that restart. I don't even remember who instigated it, and there may not have even been one of them that instigated it. It was more of they started leaning on each other. One of them started getting irritated with the other, so they shoved them even more, and it eventually escalated to the point where Austin just dumped Bubba.
Yeah,
And I mean that's short track racing, but it you could definitely see it boiling over for a solid 3 or 4 laps before Austin finally dumped him.
right. That's one of those things you see in NASCAR is one of those completely preventable crashes that somebody just lost their temper, and I believe in this case it was Austin Dillon.
Yeah.
I was fairly impressed with Tony Stewart's addition to the booth in the broadcast this week.
I have been very impressed with Tony every time he's been in the booth, because he was in the booth for this race and the Daytona 500 last year. And then there was 2 or 3 other races he was in the booth last year too. And I thought he's always been extremely good in the booth. I thought he'd be a good permanent addition to the booth. But speaking of that, it was just announced, I believe yesterday, that Kevin Harvick will be going full-time to the Fox booth in 2024 alongside Clint Boyer and Mike Joy. So I think that's a very solid addition as well. Every time Kevin Harvick, I've seen him in the booth, he has been extremely good. He's done a lot of Xfinity broadcasts, and I think he'll be a very, very good asset to that booth next year.
I think one of the coolest things they've done in the booth the past several years is have Cup drivers announce some of the Xfinity races. Not only do you get to hear from your Cup drivers that might not be able to do interviews and everything all the time, but just to hear them talk about some of their competitors from the booth, having everybody's eyes on them, I just thought it was super interesting to see who's good at it and who's not.
Yeah, and there's definitely some of them that are not cut out for it, that just are not very good in the booth. But then there's others that Kevin Harvick, Kurt Busch, Kyle Busch, even that are very, very good in the booth, and I think would make great assets to the booth when they retire. I'm actually surprised that Kurt has not gone to the booth now that he's retired, because I always thought he was probably the best out of the current drivers anytime they stuck a driver in the booth. So I'm actually surprised he hasn't gone to the booth in some form or fashion, even if it's in the truck booth. I know they had him mostly full-time in the truck booth for the last year or two, so I'm surprised that hasn't, or maybe it did stick and I just haven't seen it, but I don't think he's in the booth full-time for trucks this year.
No, I'd have to agree with you. I'd always liked it when Kurt Busch came in for an Xfinity race or even a truck race, like you said. Um, I do think he's kind of fallen off the face of the planet a little bit ever since he had that crash at Pocono last year and missed the rest of the season. I haven't heard anything from him this year.
No, you're right. Come to think of it, yeah, he's kind of been off the radar, and I don't know if that's because he's still kind of recovering from that concussion that, I mean, that you wouldn't have thought it would have taken him that long to recover from it in the first place. So I don't know. I don't know what Kurt's up to right now, and that's a very good question. Maybe we'll have to try and get him on this podcast at some point. See what see what he's been up to since he's been out of the car. Because that will be a thing going forward eventually, that we will have interviews on this on a weekly basis. We're not going to for the first probably 3 or 4 weeks here, just to get the podcast established and get some momentum going, but we will tend to have interviews. The hope is to have one every week. And if you've seen RNN, you know that we tend to have a lot of interviews on RNN usually anyway. So I don't see it being too big of an issue having one per week on here.
Yeah, and while we're kind of there, I'd like to touch on the topic of obviously Kurt Busch's concussion at the crash last year and how a lot of drivers are saying that rear end impacts were pretty difficult to withstand last year. And I know the booth touched on it a little bit during the race. NASCAR did make some changes to the car over the off season, put in some new crush panels and different foam blocks into the car just to make it absorb impacts a little bit better. I know Bubba Wallace did have a little radio outburst at one point in the race that rear end impacts did still hurt, but that and changes with the safer barrier for the Coliseum definitely NASCAR looking out for their competitors.
Yeah, definitely. And to be completely honest, it is a little surprising because NASCAR has gotten a reputation in recent years of not necessarily listening to their drivers on a lot of things. So it is good that they did listen to them on this, especially since it was something that was getting a lot of drivers injured last year. So it's good to see that they listened and that they're taking steps in the right direction to fix the safety of this car. It was very weird that they introduced this new car and they've been so gung ho about safety for the past two generations of cars, the car of tomorrow and the Gen 6 car. They've been so big on safety. And then we introduced this car and it's like they took a step backward with safety. So it is good to see them getting back in the right direction. Honestly, it should have been there already, but steps in the right direction nonetheless.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you. We saw a whole bunch of really nasty crashes with the Gen 6 car, especially the super speedways. Austin Dillon going in the catch fence, a couple of different drivers doing the same thing, and they
Ryan
always
Newman
manage to
in the
get
Daytona
out. And
500.
you'd have people flipping and
Yep.
getting into the catch fence, and they always seem to get out okay. And then last year was pretty bizarre with several hits that seemed fairly light compared to ones we've seen in the past, and then Kurt Busch going out for the whole year with a concussion. So
Yep.
nice to see him try to take some steps in a positive direction.
Yeah, I mean that Kurt Busch wreck last year didn't look like something that should have sidelined him for half a season, and in the end ended his career. It did not look like a crash that should have done that. But with the way that car was last year, it did. So yeah, it's definitely good that they have moved back in a more correct direction with the safety.
Yeah. Going forward to 2023, what are a couple drivers that kind of stand out to you that you're looking to have a good season this year?
You know, Ryan Preece impressed me a lot in the Clash. He led a lot there late in the race. And now that he's with Stuart Haas, this is the best team he's been with in the Cup Series, kind of getting his redemption in the Cup Series. I look for Ryan Preece to have a really good year. I was really curious how he would do in this car because that's a car that, with Cole Custer the last couple of years, has not run all that well. And honestly, Stuart Haas as a whole, for the most part, has not run that well for the last couple of years. So I was curious to see what he would be able to do in that car going forward. And if the Clash is any indication, I think Ryan Preece is set up for a really good year.
I'd have to agree with you on Ryan Preece. I know Tony Stewart touched on it a little bit while he was in the booth. It seemed like Tony Stewart finally got his guy for that 41 car. I know Cole Custer had a little bit of a rough time in that car. He got a win, at least one win. I think it was only
Yeah,
the one though, at
just one at
Kentucky or
Kentucky.
Kansas. But yeah, I think Tony Stewart finally found his guy for that 41 car. I know he was really enthused when he was able to sign him this year for that car. And I think for the most part, Chase Briscoe had a fairly disappointing season last year, in my opinion. He had a couple races where he was up to the front, but never really seemed to be able to run away with it like he was doing in the Xfinity series for a year.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that was Stuart Haas just has been kind of off the last couple of years. Like they're good for 2, 3, 4 wins across the entire organization the last couple of years, but not what we had seen out of them in the past, where Kevin Harvick in 2020 winning 9 races or 9 or 10 or whatever it was that season when he should have won the championship, and I will still stand by that to this day. But yeah, I think Stewart-Haas might be going back in the right direction this year.
Yeah, and I think as a whole, couple teams did really well. Obviously, it's a clash, so your big teams are going to do pretty well. I think RCR stand out pretty well to me, second and third. And all the Toyota affiliated cars did fairly well, spare for Ty Gibbs in the clash. Obviously, Martin Truex Jr. winning it. Hendrick, pretty good showing, other than the star driver for Hendrick, Chase Elliott. I know William Byron's kind of working his way up to the front for most of the race, and finally got up there and got shuffled back towards the end. And Alex Bowman and Kyle Larson both getting top fives, so Hendrick a fairly good showing too.
Yeah, definitely. And Hendrick has been back to being their powerhouse the last couple of years, so that's not surprising. Although Larson did have a fairly off year last year. I don't know if it was a championship hangover or what it was, but I look for Larson to be back in front this season. Tyler Reddick's another one I look at to be very good this season now that he's with 23XI. I think he's going to be popping off a good number of wins this year and probably will even be a championship favorite. I'd even go that far to say he might even make the championship 4.
Yeah, I'd like to see a couple races into the season and touch back on that, but I do think Tyler Reddick was very impressive last year with RCR, and I think 23XI is probably better equipment than RCR. Not one of the slight RCR at all, but with the direct affiliation with Joe Gibbs Racing and all the Toyota cars sticking together for the most part as far as equipment, from what it seems, I think Tyler Reddick could do pretty well this year.
Definitely. Well, I think that's where we're going to have to wrap it up on this one. We will be back next week to preview not only the Daytona 500, but all the festivities of Speed Week. I guess it is now. It's not Speed Weeks anymore. It's only in 1 week now, but Daytona 500, Xfinity, trucks, ARCA, duels. We got all kinds of stuff to talk about next week on this show. Hopefully you will stick around with us for the ride this season. Hopefully you enjoyed what you heard and you'll want to come back next week. Like I said, as we get a little further along, maybe 4 or 5 weeks down the road, we'll start doing interviews on here as well. So you get to hear from anybody, your favorite drivers, broadcast personalities, anyone in the industry that we feel would make a good conversation on here. We will have them on. So if you have any suggestions for someone you'd like to see on here, let us know that as well. So I think that's where we're going to wrap it up. Tyler, you got any final words for this week?
No, just excited to get the year going and excited to be maybe a bigger part of this NASCAR world for a year.
Definitely. Well, we are looking forward to having you be a part of this NASCAR world. And I think that's going to do it. So we're going to wrap it up there. This has been episode number 1 of the Rookie Stripes podcast. That's Tyler Guthrie. I'm Garth Allan on Rookie Stripes podcast for Racing News Now.